In the centuries-old clash between science and philosophy, one thing is certain. The universe won't pick a side. But we will. From the birth of atoms to the death of stars, science gives us answers. From the nature of truth to the meaning of life, philosophy asks the questions science cannot. When they meet, sparks fly, ideas collide, and sometimes entire worldviews shatter. This is where reason meets wonder. This is Stellar Stories, and tonight, science and philosophy go to war.
Round 1. Fight!
For centuries, philosophy and science were one discipline. Newton's Principia literally translates to mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Descartes wrote about physics and metaphysics as if they were two sides of the same coin. But the split began when logic wasn't enough, when nature started answering back with data. Take Aristotle. He reasoned that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones because, well, it seemed logical. A big rock should plummet faster than a pebble. But Galileo wasn't buying it. He rolled spheres of different weights down ramps, measured them with water clocks and pulse beats, and found they accelerated at the same rate. Logic bowed to experiment. And Galileo was clear. Mathematics is the language nature actually speaks. Fast forward to the 20th century. Einstein versus Henri Bergson. Einstein's relativity said time itself bends. It slows with speed and walks under gravity. For Einstein, time was whatever a clock measures. Simple, physical. Bergson, one of France's most celebrated philosophers, wasn't having it. He argued Einstein's clock time ignored la durée, the flow of lived human experience. To him, reducing time to a tick of a machine gutted it of meaning. Their showdown in Paris 1922 was brutal. Bergson gave a lecture hall packed with philosophers and intellectuals the speech of his life, only for Einstein to reply coldly, "The time of the philosophers does not exist." The fallout was so intense that when Einstein finally got his Nobel Prize, the committee carefully avoided mentioning relativity at all. They played it safe and gave it to him for the photoelectric effect. Solid, proven physics, with no angry French philosophers banging down the door. This was no polite seminar spat. These were public battles over the very nature of reality. Philosophy wanted meaning, science wanted proof, and the sparks were enough to scar even a Nobel Prize.
Round 2. Fight!
For all the brilliance philosophy gave us, it also managed to slam on the brakes of discovery more than once. The clearest example? Galileo. By the 1600s, Copernicus had already suggested the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe. Galileo's telescope backed it up. He saw Jupiter's moons orbiting their planet, not Earth. He saw phases of Venus that only made sense if it circled the Sun. But philosophy, or more precisely, the Aristotelian worldview that had become church dogma, said otherwise. Aristotle taught that the heavens were perfect, crystalline spheres with Earth at the centre. Change was a property of the corrupt earthly realm. The heavens were eternal and unchanging. To admit otherwise wasn't just bad science, it was heresy. When Galileo published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, he mocked the defenders of Aristotle with a dim-witted character named Simplicio. The Inquisition didn't laugh. They hauled him before a tribunal, forced him to recant, and sentenced him to house arrest for life. His telescope had shown the truth, but philosophy, wrapped in theology, fought to keep the Earth fixed in the centre. Fast forward to the 20th century and you see another kind of philosophical roadblock, the logical positivists. These philosophers, based in Vienna, argued that only statements verifiable by direct observation had meaning. If you couldn't prove it in a lab, it was nonsense. It sounded clean and modern, until it ran straight into quantum mechanics. Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle said you couldn't know both the position and momentum of a particle at the same time. Niels Bohr argued that quantum reality itself was probabilistic. Nature doesn't give you certainty, only chances. For the positivists, this was almost intolerable. Philosophy wanted science to be crisp, black and white, tied up neatly with what could be measured. But the quantum world wasn't neat. It was messy, spooky, and laced with probabilities. Once again, philosophy had tried to dictate the rules, and once again, science refused to play along. If philosophy sometimes slowed science down, science has also landed knockout blows that left entire philosophical traditions gasping for air. Take Darwin. For centuries, philosophers and theologians leaned on the argument from design, the idea that life was so intricate, so perfectly adapted, it had to be guided by purpose. Paley's famous watchmaker analogy summed it up. If you find a watch on the ground, you know it had a maker. Surely the same applied to eyes, wings, and ecosystems. Then in 1859, Darwin dropped on the origin of species. Natural selection explained how blind, incremental change could produce complexity without a designer. It wasn't just a scientific revelation, it was a philosophical earthquake. Victorian intellectuals were horrified. Not only had Darwin dethroned God as nature's architect, he had flattened humanity's special status in the cosmos. The backlash was furious. At a legendary debate in Oxford, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce sneered at Darwin's bulldog Thomas Huxley, asking whether he claimed descent from an ape on his grandmother's or grandfather's side. Huxley fired back, "I'd rather be descended from an ape than a man who uses his gifts to obscure the truth." It was a public humiliation for philosophy and theology. Science had shown that meaning and purpose weren't necessary for explaining life. Another blow came from neuroscience. For millennia, philosophers from Plato to Descartes argued that mind and body were separate, the brain a mere vessel for the soul. Descartes even pinpointed the pineal gland as the seat of the soul. But by the 19th and 20th centuries, neurology was dismantling that dualism piece by piece. When Broca studied stroke victims in the 1860s, he discovered damage to a specific part of the brain reliably destroyed the ability to speak. Later, Penfield's electrical probes mapped memories and sensations directly onto cortical tissue. Each experiment pushed the soul further into a corner. The mind wasn't floating above matter, it was matter. Philosophy had insisted on special essences, purposes, and souls. Science reduced them to natural processes, blind evolution, electrochemical activity. It didn't answer every question, but it left philosophers scrambling to pick up the pieces. For all the times philosophy tripped science, it's also been the scaffolding holding science upright. Strip away philosophy, and science wouldn't even know what counts as science. Take Karl Popper. In the 20th century, physics was buzzing with bold new theories, relativity, quantum mechanics, cosmology. But Popper asked a deceptively simple question. How do we separate science from pseudoscience? His answer was falsifiability. A scientific theory must make risky predictions that could, in principle, prove it wrong. Astrology failed the test. Einstein's relativity passed, predicting the bending of starlight during a solar eclipse, something that could have falsified it overnight. Popper gave science a philosophical backbone. Then came Thomas Kuhn. In 1962, he argued in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that science doesn't progress in a straight line. It lurches through paradigm shifts. Normal science works within a shared framework, Newtonian mechanics for instance, until anomalies pile up and a revolution explodes. Suddenly, Einsteinian relativity replaces Newton and the old framework collapses. Kuhn's philosophy explained the sociology of science itself, showing that discovery isn't just data, but culture, consensus, even politics. Even Einstein leaned on philosophy. He absorbed Kant's ideas about space and time being conditions of experience, and Ernst Mach's radical empiricism. When asked about his inspirations, Einstein once said, "The man to whom I owe the most is not a physicist but a philosopher, Ernst Mach." Relativity wasn't just mathematics, it was philosophy sharpened into physics. And today, fields like AI and quantum mechanics are practically begging for philosophy. What counts as intelligence? What counts as measurement? These aren't engineering questions, they're philosophical ones. Science may be the engine, but philosophy built the road. Even today, philosophy and science keep colliding on the biggest questions, and the sparks are no less dramatic. Take consciousness, a true modern battleground. Neuroscience maps brain activity down to the millisecond. fMRI scans light up when we think, remember, or feel. Many scientists argue consciousness is nothing more than neurons firing in patterns, case closed, but philosophers refuse to let it go. David Chalmers framed the hard problem. Even if you map every neuron, why does it feel like something to be alive? Why is there a first-person perspective at all? Science can chart the mechanics, but philosophy keeps asking, where's the experience hiding? Free will. Since the Enlightenment, philosophers debated whether we choose freely or whether fate locks our path. Physics added fuel. Laplace's demon, a thought experiment, imagined a superintelligence that knows every atom's position. If physics is deterministic, then free will is an illusion. Science piled on. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet wired up subjects and found that their brains showed readiness signals milliseconds before they were consciously aware of deciding. Philosophy erupted. Were we nothing more than puppets of unconscious neurons? The experiments remain contested, but the tension between agency and mechanism is unresolved. Reality itself. At the famous Solvay conferences in the 1920s, Einstein and Niels Bohr went head-to-head over quantum mechanics. Bohr argued nature is probabilistic. Reality itself doesn't exist in a definite state until measured. Einstein couldn't accept it. God does not play dice, he snapped. Bohr coolly replied, "Stop telling God what to do." It wasn't just physics, it was philosophy in disguise. What is reality? Does the universe split into many worlds every time a particle is measured? Or do hidden variables lurk underneath the randomness? A century later, no consensus. Physicists publish papers, but philosophers keep the questions alive. These aren't dusty academic squabbles. They're the battlegrounds shaping how we understand ourselves, our choices, and the universe we live in.
Final round. Fight!
For all the clashes, the truth is science and philosophy are less enemies than sparring partners. Each punch sharpens the other. Philosophy still asks the questions science needs. Without it, science risks charging ahead without a compass. What counts as evidence? What's ethical? What does explanation even mean? These are philosophical questions in lab coats, and science keeps handing philosophy fresh puzzles. When quantum physics showed particles behaving like waves until observed, philosophers had a field day. When AI began generating human-like text and art, it wasn't just an engineering feat. It forced us to ask, what counts as intelligence? What counts as creativity? In practice, they keep bleeding into each other. Bioethics brings philosophers and scientists to the same table on cloning, gene editing, and end-of-life care. The philosophy of mind now leans on neuroscience as much as logic. Cosmology is impossible to talk about without venturing into metaphysics. Even Einstein admitted he needed philosophy. He once wrote, "The man who is not philosophically inclined is not only incompletely human, but has scarcely the right to be a scientist." In the end, philosophy supplies the why, science supplies the how, and together they sketch a fuller picture of reality than either could alone. Maybe science and philosophy aren't rivals at all. Maybe they're two halves of the same restless urge to understand where we came from, what we are, and where we're going. When science moves without philosophy, it risks becoming blind power, technology with no compass, discovery with no meaning. When philosophy moves without science, it drifts into castles of thought that collapse the moment reality pushes back. But together they've given us relativity and quantum mechanics, democracy and human rights, the theory of evolution and the idea of human dignity. Einstein once sneered that the time of the philosophers does not exist. But the truth is, without philosophy, science wouldn't know what time means in the first place. So maybe the war between science and philosophy was never about one winning. Maybe it was about both refusing to lose. Because in the end, science is philosophy, armed with data. I really hope you enjoyed this dive into science versus philosophy. We love both here on Stellar Stories. As a tiny channel, every interaction from you helps immensely, so please drop a like, comment, and maybe even subscribe. See you next time.